Well, I hope everybody's had a good time so far in the course. We've finished our first 2 weeks where we've gone over some of the historical documents that make up, that discuss some of the ethical issues that have occurred in the past in various clinical trials. And we've also looked at a few of the historical documents related to ethics in clinical trials. So we're putting our foundational knowledge together. And I did post out there on the discussion board the FDA guidance to industry, or guidance for industry rather, on the use of control groups, the use of placebos. A couple of you, someone asked about that, and so I put that document out there. I would encourage you to go out there and download it and kind of take a look at it. I think you'll find it to be fairly interesting. So in this week's lessons, what we're going to do is we're going to take the information that we've learned that's been foundational and see how it begins to shape and even govern what we do on a daily basis with our daily tasks as they relate to the clinical research environment. So for this week's readings, what I'd like for you to do is look at the FDA regulations overview presentation by Dr. Hirschfield. It's about 30 slides. I think it'll give you a pretty good overview of what that consists of, what those regulations consist of. And then our good clinical practice requirements are contained in basically in two places. We have 21 CFR 312, which is investigational new drug application subpart D, which is the responsibilities of sponsors and investigators. I'll put the link out there on Blackboard to that specific regulation, and it's about 9 pages. So I'd like you to kind of read through that and be familiar with it. I don't think it'll take you very long to do that. The other section of good clinical practice that I want you to take a look at is ICH GCP E6 sections 4 and 5. They are in your textbook starting on page 83, and they're about 10 pages or so. The difference between these two, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, is that 21 CFR 312 are actually laws that are part of the federal code. Section 21 governs drugs, and specifically pharmaceutical drugs. And several parts or subparts of that code govern excuse me, how we conduct clinical trials. ICH, on the other hand, is the International Conference on Harmonization. It's made up of a consortium of regulatory authorities in 3 different regions: the United States, Europe, and Japan. Most of the countries in the world now follow ICH guidelines as far as how they conduct and regulate clinical trials. It is important to understand that although it's a guideline, the FDA does recognize ICH GCP E6 specifically as their standard, as their current thinking. They call it in terms of clinical practice, good clinical practice. So as you look through those 3 documents, that'll give you a pretty good idea of, of how those regulations are similar and how they're different. Our learning objectives this week are going to be to discuss the GCP requirements that are associated with FDA regulations, which are contained in 21 CFR, and also the ICH guidelines, which are ICH E6. I've put both of those links on Blackboard in the week 3 folder, so you'll be able to have access to them pretty easily. We're also going to cite the differences and similarities between the FDA and ICH good clinical practice requirements. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to discuss briefly our Project 1, your first project, which is going to be a comparison and a contrasting of the GCP requirements for both FDA and ICH. That will be due on April 12th. There is an article written by Paul Below that is in the week 3 folder. So I'd like for you to pull that down and start looking at that, and then look at the project 1 requirements. And I think as you read through those, it'll be pretty similar or pretty straightforward, rather, for you to take a look at. I do want you to go ahead and get started on that. There's no discussion board this week, so as you go through the readings, it won't take you long to do that. Do get started on your first project and be ready to turn that in by April 12th. I'd like for you to go ahead and kind of get going on that this week. If there are questions that you have, please post them to the questions for the instructor on the discussion board. That way everybody can see the answer and they can see the question as well. So at any rate, be taking a look at that and let me know what questions you have. As I just mentioned, good clinical practice is what we refer to as how we operate in a clinical research environment, in a regulated environment. And there are basically two documents that explain that. First, we have the Fda Regulations, which are the law for clinical trials that are conducted in the United States or are also conducted under the jurisdiction of the FDA, which could include and does include sites that are around the world. So even though we think of the FDA as being primarily a US-based agency, any trial that's conducted under an investigational new drug application that's been submitted to the US Food and Drug Administration, any sites that are conducting a trial under that IND are subject to the jurisdictional authority of the FDA. They can be inspected by the FDA. They can be held accountable for not following FDA guidelines. So keep that in mind as we go through everything this week. We also have the ICH, International Conference on Harmonization Gcp Guidelines. They're contained in Section 6 of the ICH document. And most of the countries around the world have accepted those as their standard practice for conducting clinical trials. As I mentioned earlier, the FDA does consider ICH GCP to be the agency's current thinking on good clinical practice. So kind of keep that in mind. As you go through and you look at these and you read them and you digest them, you'll discover that they're very similar. There are some differences, some fairly specific differences, but there aren't very many. They're very similar, and I think you'll see that as you go along and take a look at them. So, for instance, in the FDA Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, Section 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations that governs drugs, there are basically several parts that we want to pay attention to with regard to clinical trials. So, for example, 21 CFR Part 11 discusses electronic records and electronic signatures and some of the requirements associated with that. For those of you that were in the Introduction to Data Management class, we discussed some of those in that class. The next area is 21 CFR Part 50, which is the protection of human subjects. We'll actually refer to that a little later in our course. The next one we'll focus on is going to be 21 CFR 54, which is financial disclosure, where principal investigators and others conducting a trial are required to disclose any financial positions that they may have with a sponsor that they're conducting a trial on behalf of. 21 CFR 56 governs the use of institutional review boards, how they're comprised, how they operate, what their responsibilities are. We'll get into those a little bit later in the course. The one that you'll probably spend most of your time on is going to be 21 CFR Part 312, which is the requirements for the investigational new drug application, specifically Subpart D, which is responsibilities for investigators and sponsors. And then finally, the other area that we touch on a little bit in this course is going to be the new drug application, which is contained in 21 CFR 314. So as you go through the readings this week, understand there's no discussion board this week. Instead, I'd like for you to get started on Project 1, which is going to be your comparison of GCP requirements between the FDA and ICH. What we have, there are 6 topics that are contained in the project. I'd like you to choose 4 of them and kind of work to illustrate and discuss the comparison of similarities and differences on those specific 4 topics that you chose. So I'd like you to read the article written by Paul Belo, where he discusses the differences and the similarities between the two requirements. I think you'll find it to be fairly interesting. He'll cite a number of different specific pieces of information contained both in the FDA and the ICH documents. I think you'll be able to easily see those. And then I think the project itself will be fairly simple, fairly straightforward. I don't think it's going to take you longer than maybe a few hours to complete that. There will be a link there on Blackboard in the weekly assignments folder for you to submit that. It will be due by April 12th, so you've got 2 weeks to get that done. But I do encourage you to go ahead and see if you can get as much of that done this week as possible, because you will have your midterm exam coming up here in the next week or 2 as well. So I don't want you to let too much time go by before working on that. If you have questions about it, post them to the discussion board and the questions for the instructor area, and I'll be happy to respond to them. If there's anything that truly specific about it you need to email me about, that's fine too. So at any rate, go ahead and get started on that. I think you'll find it to be pretty interesting and pretty straightforward. But if you have questions, you'll certainly do let me know.